Millions and millions of years ago, Adobe XD did not have dark mode. But today, Adobe XD still does not have dark mode. Hey everyone, hope you're all doing well on this Friday afternoon. Figured I'd start off with some very poor comedy. That's all I got, really. My name's Howard Pinsky, Senior XD Evangelist here at Adobe. It's Friday, we made it through the week. Weekend is coming on up. Hope you're all well. If you are tuning in live on the chat, seems like some of you are seeing my poor impressions now. Cody and Laura and Cheryl and Animate Elephant, that's a great name. Philip and Abhiji, probably butchered that, I do apologize. Andrea, great to see everyone. And Anahit, if you are tuning in live, let me know in the chat who you are and where you're tuning in from. We've got Andres from Germany. Nick is in the house. Felix is in the house. Great to see all of you. You had me at the first half. I'm sorry. I tried. One day it will happen. I just don't know when. Could be next year. Could be the year after. Could be in 2024. Who knows? All right, so we are here for another Masterclass, episode number 35. We've been here for 35 weeks. That's incredible. That's a long time. And many of you in the chat have been here for all 35 episodes, which is wonderful. I really do appreciate all of you sticking around. Today, we're going to have a little bit of fun with some cyberpunk UI. So let me hop over to my screen. Some of you may have seen this. I posted this on Twitter. I posted this on Instagram, which I'm on right now. Go give me a follow. Why not, right? But this is kind of what we're going to be creating today. It's hard to see because Instagram compresses the heck out of these things, but, very cyberpunk inspired UI. And of course, we're going to be using 3D transforms to make some of these interactions happen. It's going to be a lot of fun. And we're here for the next hour. So if you have questions about how this is done, questions about XD, I already addressed dark mode at the beginning. Don't ask that because I don't know. Throw them in the chat. We're here having fun. And then later today, I'm going to be hosting the XD Daily Creative Challenge day number 4. And then right before that, I just mixed up everything. So right after this episode, Kyle T. Webster's coming up with his I think it's Fresco, right? Illustration Masterclass. Okay. Oh, he's going to be using Photoshop today. He does Fresco a lot, but Photoshop today. So Kyle T. Webster right after me. And then I'm going to be back with the Adobe XD Masterclass. We're going to be talking about card flip animations. A lot of fun, right? All right. So let me hop over to Adobe XD and we are going to get going. Andrea says, hello, Howard. Back at last 3 days after my final exams as a media designer. Hope you did well in your final exams. I know those are super stressful, but thanks for joining me and good luck on whatever comes next after your exams. All right, we are here in Adobe XD, and since this is typically, these gaming interfaces are typically designed for either computers or they're designed for consoles, which is displayed on a television, we'll want to go for a 16:9 aspect ratio. So right over here, we've got our web 1920. I'm going to go for that. Some of you possibly may go a little bit larger there's double Howard. Is there double Howard? What's going on? Henry says double Howard. What's happening? Is my audio doubled? Or is I don't know what's happening. So someone let me know. Maybe it's maybe nothing. All right, so I'm going to hop into this artboard 1920 by 1080, and we are going to get going. Now, the first thing that I want to add is an image in the background. And if you haven't used Adobe XD before, super simple to do that. You could go ahead and hop over to Finder or your libraries, and let me go ahead and grab an image here, and I could just drag it in, right? The problem that we're going to run into, audio is good, all good. You are later on. Okay. Oh, double. Oh, right. Yeah, I should have caught that. Right. There's two of me. I have 2 streams today. It's been a week. So, we could go ahead and just drag an image directly onto the canvas, right? Just like I did, just like that. but it doesn't really fill anything. And if we have a very large image, right, then it's going to kind of overflow the entire artboard. So what I want to do is just grab my rectangle, which is right here over to the left-hand side, and draw out a rectangle across the entire artboard. Now you probably can't see it because it's the same color as the art. Ooh, that's ugly. It's the same color as the artboard was, but there we go. I changed it a little bit. And now, whether the image is too small or too large, when you drag it in, it's going to automatically fill that artboard and that image for you, right? Perfect. That's exactly what we want. It's already looking like cyberpunk. I'm going to actually double click and adjust the mask a little bit to focus a little bit more on this car. That looks pretty good. Right about there. All right. So now we're going to start with some of our UI elements. And what I want to do, just so I can really visualize these elements as I'm designing them, is I'm going to very simply add a little bit of a blur on this particular shape. Now there's two ways we can do it, right? We can either grab a rectangle and draw another one across the artboard and then turn on background blur right down here at the bottom of our properties inspector. Boop, turn that on. And then of course we can adjust our blur as necessary. So I can turn the brightness down to 0 and then just play with this a little bit. And that looks pretty good, right? I'm kind of digging that. Or what we can do, if I hop into my layers panel, if we wanted to blur the actual object, instead of a background blur, we would simply choose an object blur, just like that. Now, because the object goes right to the edge of the artboard, you probably will notice that the edges are a little bit blurred. They're almost like feathered, right? So in that case, I think I'm going to simply stick with this shape here. And this will help a lot, because when we go to actually create an interaction, an animated interaction, we'll simply be able to just drop the opacity to kind of create that blur effect, right? So I'm going to go ahead and keep it at that. All right, so let's go ahead and start creating some of these elements. Now, the first element I want to create is this area over to the right where it might have some tabs, might have some information, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my rectangle and draw one out, just like this. Now, sometimes what I like to do is I like to have references. So on here, I do have a bunch of different images that I grabbed from the Cyberpunk game. And I can just kind of cycle through some of these and see which one looks pretty good. And basically, we want to recreate this element over to the right. So, I might just want to grab this image, drag it directly into Adobe XD, just so I have it somewhere on my document that I can kind of reference. I can put it on my artboard, or I can put it off of the artboard. Doesn't really matter, right? I'm going to move this up a little bit, move this over, and we're going to recreate basically this, right? All right, so what we're going to do, we have this rectangle, and there are no rounded corners. There are some sharp-edged corners, but there are no completely rounded corners. So I'm not going to really worry too much about these corners here, but I do want to start kind of molding this rectangle to mimic what we have over here to the left. And I can start doing that by simply double-clicking on the rectangle. This will give me access to the path. And what I can do now is I can start adding points. So if I zoom in here quite a bit, and noticing as I'm hovering over top of the path, we have that point kind of moving on, right? And that'll allow me to simply just click, boop, just like that. And now I have an additional point. And now I can grab a point like this and just move it on down, like that. So I held down my shift key to move it down by 10 pixels. I can move it down 20 if I wanted to make a really sharp edge. That looks okay. And I can do the exact same thing down here at the bottom. So I'm simply going to click, select this point, and boop, boop. There we go. Now I have nice sharp corners on a little bit of an angle, right? Now if we take a look here, we've got this section where there's almost like this tab, right? Now there's a few ways we can go about doing that. We can dive in here and add a point, and then add another point and pull this down, and then pull this down, right? And they'll snap into place. So we can do that, right? Another thing you can possibly do is use a Boolean object. So I can go ahead, grab a rectangle, and draw out the area that I want cut out. So it's probably somewhere right about in the center, and my smart guides are helping me out, letting me know that this is the center of this particular object, right? So I can pop that there. And then to use the Boolean objects, you need 2 or more objects selected. So I have this object that we just created selected. I'm also going to hold down my Shift key and click on the object we've been working on. That'll make sure both of them are selected. And you can see that inside of your layers panel to the right. And then at the top right-hand corner of the properties inspector, you've got your Boolean options, add, subtract, intersect, and so on, right? I'm going to go ahead and press the second one, which is our subtract option. And that will cut out a hole inside of this shape. Very similar to what we did with the path. So options are available. You can kind of go down whichever path you want. Now, the interesting benefit of using a Boolean object, and I should probably name this. What is this called? I don't know what it's called. Tabs, maybe, possibly, I don't know. So the interesting benefit of this is that it's non-destructive. So if you wanted to bring that back, you can ungroup it like that, right? Or you can dive into this particular Boolean object and just move these shapes around. So you can make this tab a little bit larger, you kind of move it around like that, you know, add a hole, a lot of different ways you can go about that, right? And if you take a look at this, it's looking pretty good. I do say so for myself. It might be a little bit too deep, so I'm just gonna just bump this up a touch, right? There we go. Now, of course, there is this additional tab right here in the background, right? So for that, all we have to do is grab our good old rectangle one more time, draw one out like that. I'm gonna leave a little bit of space right about here. So there's a touch of breathing room, a cutout. There you go, Cheryl, thank you. Words are hard when you're streaming. And then there's a little bit of a notch or could be a cutout as well, or an angle right at the top. So we're going to do the exact same thing we've been doing with the previous object. Double click to access the path, click to create a point, and then boop, there we go. We now have a little cutout. And of course you can move these points around to get the exact angle that you're looking for. And I'm going to call this tab and simply move it behind this Boolean object at the back. There we go. So now we have our lovely looking tabs, and it looks just like it does on this side, okay? Perfect. So next thing we want to do is start kind of creating what this actually looks like in terms of styling. So there are a few things we can do. You know, of course we can go ahead and add a gradient if we wanted to. We can move one, you know, move a gradient over here, move the point over here, and then maybe on the right-hand side, might be a little bit darker. I want to stick in that kind of red tone, right? And then on the left, it might be a little bit lighter. And you don't want to go too crazy with this. If you take a look at here, there's just a little bit of red. Of course, there's a lot of texture. We're not going to be worrying too much about the texture, but there's just a little bit of red. It's not too drastic. You know, if I were to grab this color and do something like that, it's just way too much. But just a little bit of red kind of seeping in, just like that. And on this side, again, it's going to be a little bit darker. Looks pretty good right there. And I can copy this. Actually, you know what? Let's tackle the border just for a second. I do want a little bit of a red border. You can put this border on the inside or the outside, completely up to you. I'm going to stick with the inside and just make it a little bit red, just like that, right? There we go. And it does look like on this UI element, there's a little bit of a shadow. It's not a very harsh shadow, but it's a fairly subtle shadow. So I can go ahead and add a shadow as well. Nothing too crazy, just like that, all right? So now that the styling is fairly complete, I'm not completely loving it. One thing I love to do, and many of you who watch my streams definitely know this, is I love experimenting and utilizing background blurs. So if I go ahead and just turn on the background blur down at the bottom, very similar to how we turned it on with the shape in the background, I'm going to turn that on, and by default, it's going to use basically the brightness level as to determine the color, right? So I can bump it up, I can bump it down, and it looks okay, right? I'm going to bump up the blur. But what I want to do, I want to bring in some of the gradient that we spent time creating. So I still have it up here, right? I created that linear gradient, but what I want to do is bring back some of that color. And that's where the effect opacity option down at the bottom of the background blur section comes into play. As I increase this, it's going to start bringing back some of that color. And you're noticing, right, if I increase it all the way to 100%, it's basically, you know, doesn't look like anything's going on, right? I can turn on the background blur, turn it off, nothing's really changed. So we just want to drop it a little bit. And I can also drop the blur just a touch. So now we almost have the best of both worlds. We have our linear gradient, but we also have our background blur which is bringing in some of the color and some of the design from our background, right? So Philip says, what's the trick with the background blurs that they look so great in streams and look so ugly when I try them out? Exactly what I'm just talking about, right? You want to make sure that they're very subtle, especially if you're going to be putting text layers and objects on top of this container, right? If you have something like this and then you don't blur it a lot and then you have it like bumped up the brightness, it just doesn't look that great, right? But if we go back to what we were just working on and we keep it very subtle, and you can now go back, now that we've brought in some of that effect opacity, we can go back and tweak some of this. So if you wanted a little bit more red on this side and then maybe darker on this side, right? Again, very subtle, but it still has a little bit of that background blur. And one of the nice benefits of background blurs is as you move it around this document, right? You're noticing it's pulling in real time much of that information. So that's looking pretty good. So now that this is done, I'm pretty happy with the styling. I'm going to right click, I can press copy or Command or Control C, a lot of different ways to copy. And then on this shape here, this tab, I'm going to simply right click and then paste appearance. You can also use the Command or Control Alter option and then V key. And that'll take the exact same gradient and pop it on there. Now, I'm kind of looking at this, especially compared to this, and I don't think the linear gradient really works in this particular case. So what I might want to do is just switch back to a solid color and then maybe just drop the color until it sort of matches this tab over here, right? And just play around with that until it's right about there. Or what I could have done, right? If I wanted to keep some of that red on the left-hand side, let me go back. I can simply just change the color of this gradient on the right. So I can bring this up a little bit so that it matches basically the left edge of this particular tab, right? And that looks okay. And I can also play around with the left as well if I wanted to add a little bit more darkness, right? Munir says, I just got an idea of designing an Iron Man helmet UI. Ooh, that could be interesting, Munir. I would love to see that. Work on that. Use 3D transforms and then tweet it at me. I'd love to see that. So, it's not exactly what this is, right, over here, but it's got a fun style. It's got that background blur. Things are looking pretty good. Now, there's also this area on the right. Now, this, I want to actually show you how you can create something like this using the pen tool. We've previously used the rectangle tool and edited the path for these two objects. But you can also use the pen tool, especially if you're trying to replicate something. So I'm going to grab the pen tool from the tools bar to the left and simply click. I'm holding down my shift key so that I'm constraining this to a perfect up and down line or a vertical line. And I can just kind of go through this and just finish this off, right? And there's a little bit of a dip in here. And of course I could go back and change the path a little bit later on. But I'm going through and just making some very small changes, and there we go. Now, by default, it's only a border-based shape when you're using the pen tool. So I'm going to turn on the fill, and there's my shape, right? I'm kind of happy with it. It's not exact, but it's not bad. And now what we can do is, I'm kind of digging the styling on this. So just like we did before, copy, hop over here, paste appearance. Now, because I'm using, actually it doesn't look too bad. I was going to say because I'm using a linear gradient on such a small shape, it may look a bit strange, but the colors are fairly similar from the left and the right. If they were drastic, it would look kind of strange, right? So I don't want to do that. I'm going to go back to a solid color, maybe drop it a touch. And the border is a little bit too strong. So I'm going to actually just drop the opacity on that border just a little bit, just like that. And maybe move this over to the side. Now that's obviously way too big, right? So I can just zoom in here so I can see what we're working on. Drag that down so it matches. Drag this up. And we've got our shape. Looking pretty good, right? Maybe I'll give a little bit of a spacing, just like that. And just tweak the color a little bit. There we go. Maybe up, down, I don't know. I can't decide. Can always change it later, right? Cornell's asking, are you going to play Cyberpunk 2077 on your new Xbox? Yeah, I probably will. I'm likely going to wait. I don't like that. it's kind of blending too much. So in this case, I may want to just increase the effect opacity so it's not blending too much with the background. And going back to what Philip was talking about, working with background blurs, if you're working on a very small object, it could seem like it's being blurred a lot more than some of the larger objects. So bringing back the effect opacity or increasing it can help kind of let it stand out. So yeah, Cornell, yeah, I think I'm going to wait for the next gen update, because the version of Cyberpunk 2077 that's coming out next week, I think it is, or 10 days or something like that, it's not fully optimized for the new Xbox and PS5. So I'm going to probably wait until the next gen update comes out and then dive into that. I don't know how I feel about this border. It's not bad. I think it'll work. We can always make changes to it later. But what I want to do now is really start working on some of the additional elements that are inside of this container. And we might want some tab names, right? So I'm going to grab my text tool and just type out the word, let's say hacking. And the typeface I'm going to be using, there's a lot of different typefaces, and I would suggest you go to fonts.adobe.com and just look up some of the different stylistic typefaces. There are quite a few, but Rift is a pretty good one. It has a little bit of more of a condensed feel, and it's not, very angular, but it also has a little bit of that going on. So I'm going to choose Rift, and let's try Demi Bold, make it a little bit larger, and that's looking okay. I think that could work. Let's position it about 24 pixels from the left. Now, obviously, the color of this text layer not working, right? So we're going to do two things to this. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to change the fill. So I'm going to click on the fill, and I'm going to change this to a nice bright bluish green color, just like that. And that looks pretty good, right? But I also want to, we're all about neon and glows and things like that in UIs like this. So I'm going to turn on a shadow. Now, usually we use shadows for things like this, right? That just doesn't work, right? So what we're going to do, we're actually going to set this to a nice light blue, like that. I'm going to set the Y value to 0. So it's essentially hugging this shape, and then really increase the blur, like that. And I hold down my shift key, press the up arrow to increase by 10 pixels, and then, kind of dial this in. And I can also play around with, maybe if I want to go back to medium, and just play with this until I'm kind of happy with the way things are looking. It's okay. It could work. Laura's saying, is Adobe planning on having a rework it stream on XD as they have for PS and AI? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but that could be fun. That definitely could be fun. All right, so that's looking okay. And now over to the left, I would assume inactive tab, what we might want is something else. So this could be data. And this one, because it's inactive, we want to change the styling a little bit. So in this case, we're simply going to change the text color to red and then the shadow color to red as well, just like that. Maybe let's see what regular looks like. You know what, I don't know. There's regular, there's maybe for the inactive one, we can do regular, just drop the weight a little bit. And then for the active one, we can do medium, right? I think that could work. All right, that's looking pretty good. All right, so a few more things we might want to add is some additional text layers, some headers and sections on this particular section. So I can make my life a little bit easier by just duplicating some of these shapes, just like that. And this one, if I zoom over here or pan over here, camera control. All right, camera control. And we can probably keep the same sort of styling going on, but I may actually just drop the shadow a little bit, just like that, right? Then we've got this tier over here to the right. It does look quite a bit smaller, and it looks like, if I'm not mistaken, it looks like it's aligned to the top. So Kareem is asking, what typeface is that, or what is a typeface? Well, typeface is just a collection of characters, numbers, basically, the Rift is a typeface, for example. Some people call it fonts, and sometimes they're interchangeable. So I'm going to duplicate this over to the right and type out tier 0. Now again, this is a little bit smaller and it looks like it's kind of aligned to the top. So I'm going to just drag this down a touch and move it on over, just like that. Now this one is 34 pixels from the left-hand side, and this one I'm going to make sure is also 34 pixels. 34 is not the greatest number, but we're going to run with it. Oh boy, okay. Someone's addressing dark mode. How about dark mode for UI, blah, 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 blah. You know, I've talked about dark mode a lot. I also jokingly addressed it at the beginning of this stream. You know, all of us on the XD team and various teams within Adobe want dark mode, but it's, number one, it's not a huge priority right now. There are a lot of actual design and prototyping functionality features that are definitely higher priority than dark mode. And number two, even though it may not seem like it from watching in from the outside, it's a very complicating feature, especially when you're working on Windows and Mac, and both of those operating systems have different guidelines for dark versions of applications. And then Adobe has design systems we have to work with, so it's a very complicating feature. But it'll happen eventually. I don't know when, but one day we will get dark mode and all of our eyes will thank us. All right. Right underneath this, if you take a look here, we've got a little bit of a border, but this border has a bit of a fade right at the end, right? So to help with that process, I am going to, what's the shortcut for seeing the pink guides, Laura's asking? It is Alt or Option. So I have this layer selected right here. If I want to see how far it is from the containing layer or the layer behind it or the one to the left, could be a bunch of different things. Hold down Alt or Option and those will appear. So it's showing me right now it's 34 pixels from the left, 85 from the top, 288 from the right, and 262 from the bottom. All right, so I'm going to grab my rectangle, draw one out across here just like that. And I'm going to turn off the border. And I want a little bit of a gradient, very subtle, right? So I'm going to go into the fill, set solid, change from solid color to linear gradient. I want to make sure that it's going left to right, just like that, and all the way over here. Now the color on the right, I'm going to have a nice red. The color on the left, I can actually just sample the same color, but I want to add one additional stop. So I'm going to click right about here to add an additional stop. And this is essentially where it's going to start fading away, right? And if I click on, now that that stop has been added, if I click on the first point, what I can do is just grab the opacity slider over to the right and drag it on down just like that, right? And now we have a nice fade, which somewhat mimics what we've got over here. Now, a lot of the elements on this particular design look a little bit blurred or feathered. Now, I don't know if that's because of the compression of the image or because it was a screenshot of the game. So, if you do want to go down that route, you can go ahead and just add a very simple object blur right down here at the bottom and just, try, let's say 1 pixel. Can you do decimals? Oh, you can't. Okay. So, 1 pixel could get you that. Again, if it requires an object blur. It probably doesn't. It's probably nice and sharp. It was just the compression that kind of made it look blurred, possibly. And totally get it. I hope that happens in the future. I hope so too. I love dark mode. But, I bothered the team a lot about, I jokingly bothered the team a lot. But again, very complicating feature. And I can't talk about next year's roadmap, but we have some things on there that I guarantee you that if I were to ask you, do you want this feature or dark mode? 99% of you would say, I want this feature. Got some good stuff coming. That's all I can say. All right, so that's looking pretty good, right? And we can, of course, duplicate this downwards and kind of move it around. We can also, here's one thing you might want to consider when you're designing elements like this. Turn this into a component. So if I go ahead and right-click, make component, or hop into my libraries and make component here, I can also do it in my properties inspector to the right. Press that. Now I have a component, right? And the advantage of this is if I do have additional borders going down this shape, right? And I decide, you know what, I don't like the style, or I want to go back to that blurred look. I just have to dive in to this main component, which by the way is the one with the solid green diamond. Dive in there, turn on object blur, and it's going to blur all of them. Or if I wanted to, let's say, get rid of that fade, I can do that. And it's going to change all of them, right? Or maybe this could be a little bit darker. And this could be a little bit darker. I don't know. Not digging that. I think this is fine. So Obina is asking, when are we getting component naming structure or a way to organize components? So libraries, components, things like that is a big priority for us. I don't know exactly when many of these additional features are coming, but it's something that teams are actively exploring. There are some things that are being actively developed, so stay tuned. But we definitely know that things like that are needed for libraries, especially large design systems. So stick around for that. All right, now down here we have some additional text layers. Now you're going to notice there's a difference between these headers and also these text layers here. These headers are all caps, and these ones down here are not, right? So what we're going to do, we could go ahead and duplicate this, but you know what? I'm going to just press my text tool and type out duration, right? Now, what you're going to notice is that, you know, this text layer here has caps, even though you probably can't see it, but even though I didn't hold down my shift key or press caps locks. And down at the bottom in this properties inspector, uppercase is not on, right? And if I press lowercase, nothing happens. What is happening, right? That's because of the typeface. So this typeface in particular, this Rift typeface, is only caps. So even if you don't hold shift or don't have your caps lock on, so keep that in mind. Some typefaces, all caps. So in that case, I'm going to go to Refrigerator Deluxe. I don't know why some typefaces are named that way. I spelled duration wrong, by the way. There we go. And duration, I think it was like 0 seconds. It's an interesting typeface name, but I'm digging it. But this one, you know, it has uppercase, it has lowercase, but it also has a bit of that futuristic kind of sharp-edged feel to it. So I think it could work in a situation like this. And we're going to go for nice white, just like that, right? And then I can either press return and cool down 0 seconds, and then upload time 1.5 seconds, right? There we go. I'm going to inset it just a little bit. Noticing here, it kind of almost aligns with the fade, and some of these are a little bit different, right? These separators that we're working with, right? There we go. And we've got those smart guides and padding helping me out, letting me know that things are nicely aligned as they should be. Now, one more thing you could potentially do if you want to get really interesting and creative and keep things organized and make your life a little bit simpler is use stacking. And we're going to get into that in just a moment. Let's actually add this down here. We're just going to add one more text layer, grants full remote control of the camera. It's a little bit larger, but it does contain lowercase letters. So we're going to want to stick with that refrigerator typeface, right? Grants remote control of the camera. And the styling is very similar actually to the header, but it's a little bit smaller. So if I select this header, I'm going to copy it and paste the appearance, right? Now it did change it to the Rift typeface, but I can just change it to refrigerator, make it a bit smaller. And there we go. All right, I'm going to line it up with this. Make sure this is all lined up nicely. Perfect. Okay. So going back to what I was talking about with stacks, we want to make sure that, you know, we can very easily move things around as needed. We can start utilizing stacks. So let me actually just separate some of this stuff just a little bit. Just like that. Right. And then I can move this up a touch. Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and start selecting many of these elements. So I'm going to select this background shape, And I'm going to select all of these additional layers here. Just like that. So with all of those selected, I'm going to Command and Control G to pop them into a group. And I forgot the hacking text layer. That's okay. I can move it up here. Bam. There we go. And this will be called tabs, for example, right? And then over within the properties inspector to the right, I can turn on a stack. And what that's going to do is it's going to look inside of this particular group, and it's going to determine the orientation that the layers are laid out. And it's also going to enable padding. So it's letting me know that at the top, it's 85 pixels. At the left, it's 34, 38, and 34. So I can go ahead and, adjust this if I needed to, right? To make it bigger, to make it smaller. That looks pretty good though. But if I dive in here, you're also noticing it automatically grouped these two elements for me. So it did a really good job at, figuring out where things are supposed to be, what's supposed to be grouped with what, right? And I can adjust the spacing in between, right? Just like that. But also, if I needed to add additional items, let's say for example, we wanted to add an additional line item here. If I can just press return and type out like hello. It's going to automatically move all the layers below it. It's also going to automatically adjust the background size. Let's see, can you change the measurement units from points to pixels in Adobe XD? You cannot. That'd be a nice suggestion for the future. AdobeXD.uservoice.com is a great place to either upvote or suggest features for XD. All right, so this is looking pretty good. I'm kind of digging how things are looking. I'm going to make sure to actually just group all of these elements and call this Control Center. I don't know what this whole thing is called, but we're going to run with it, right? Perfect. All right. Pretty happy with the way things are looking. I think we've more or less, we didn't tackle this, but that's okay. We can tackle that another time. I do want to move on to some additional features, right? Which in particular, these guys over here. And we're going to also explore a little bit of, hover effects as well. So for this, what I can do is I can go ahead, just like we did before, we can grab our pen tool and, trace it out, or we can use our rectangle tool. So I'm going to go ahead and use the rectangle tool. These are all on a little bit of an angle, as you can see. So using the pen tool to trace them out is going to give us a little bit of problem. It's going to kind of skew things a little bit. So I've got that set. I'm going to double click to access the path. And the same thing like we did before. Just dive in here and start adding some points. Now these two, I'm actually going to bump these in just a little bit. And up here it looks a little bit strange, so I'm going to bring this inwards a little bit. That's looking a little bit better. The one on this side looks okay. I might want to just bump these in, maybe bump this down a touch. There we go. All right, that's looking pretty good. So styling wise, a lot of it's going to be kind of similar to what we did with this. Where did it go? This guy over here, right? We're going to be using background blurs. We're going to be using some glows, a lot of fun stuff like that. So what we're going to do to start is I might just want to just sample one of these colors. If I do want to get it exact, I can very easily sample one of those colors, right? It's like a dark, very, very dark blue, right? I can even bump it up a touch just to give it a little bit more color. That way, when I do add a background blur, I can safely drop the brightness and then bring up the effect opacity, and it'll have a nice look to it, right? When, if ever, will we get to create our own sections similar to components, text, and color? So, Jonathan, that might be going off of, where is that other question? The question that Obina asked earlier about, libraries, components, organization, things like that. Again, I don't know if you might have missed the answer, but that's a big priority for us. Additional features and organization for libraries and design systems, things like that. So a lot is being worked on. I don't have a timeline to provide right now, but stay tuned. All right. Now on the inside, we might want a little bit of a border. You might be able to see that there's actually a little bit of a blurred border going on, right? So there's two things we can do. One, we can add a simple border, right? We can sample possibly like this, sample one of these colors. Make it a little bit larger, right? And that looks okay, right? Especially for the inactive state, which is simply this. So I can just drop the opacity, and we now have our inactive state, right? But of course, once we get to the hover states or the active states, that's when we're going to get a little bit creative, and I'll get to that in a moment. But let's go ahead and type out camera control. There we go. And you're noticing, very similar to the tabs on the other design, is that these are all uppercase. So we could either press the all uppercase button right here, right? Or we can switch back to the Rift typeface that we used previously. And this will help us keep consistency with the tab headers on the other design. So I'm going to keep Rift. Let's go for a medium. And I can sample this color if I'm really particular. There we go. And I'll maybe make that a little bit bigger. Let's go for 32. Looks pretty good, right? Then over here, there's some sort of a number. Make that larger. Probably not going to add all the elements in this particular design, but I do want to also add this element here, whatever this is. I'm not sure what it is, probably some sort of container or icon of some sort. And you know what? Let's grab the pen tool. Just very easily just trace this up. Again, you could use the rectangle tool just like we did to create the container that it's sitting within, but that works, right? And the styling is actually very similar to the container it's sitting within. So I can select that container, copy it, and then simply paste the appearance, just like that. And it looks like the background might be a little bit darker. So I'm going to just dive in here and just drop it just a touch, just a little bit. So it almost looks like it's kind of inset into that container in the background, right? Now, just to satisfy my design brain, I just want to make sure these are nicely, fairly parallel, right? It looks okay. I think that could work. All right, beautiful. Again, I'm not going to worry about these little elements here. Maybe, okay, we'll maybe add a little bit of a shape here. We're not going to fill it in with any text. Maybe we will, I don't know. Maybe 4 pixels possibly for the rounded corners. And actually, it kind of looks like this. So copy and then paste the appearance, bam. But the border is a little bit more in your face, right? So I'm actually going to dive in here and just increase the opacity of that border. Maybe drop the size to 1. There we go. Or maybe I'll bump it back up to 2. All right. And then very simply, ready. There we go. All right. We're getting somewhere, right? But again, you know, we've got these 2 different states. We have our inactive state, which is this one and this one down here. We also have an active state, which is with Command and Control G to group them. I'm going to name this, what is this thing called? Option? I don't know. Could be an option, right? Option. Now here, I'm going to select the background, or the border in this case. And the border is going to be just like that, a little bit of an object blur. And you can also go ahead and play around with blend modes. So color dodge, for example, right? That looks interesting. I can duplicate it again and it'll give me an even more interesting look. Now, one other thing we can do is if you take a look at the right-hand side in your properties inspector, we've got a few options for our borders: inner stroke, outer stroke, and center stroke. Right now it's set to inner. So that glow is not really, is the stream freezing for someone else? Hope not. Looks like my connection is okay. So maybe give it a refresh and hopefully that helps. All right. Juan says, I was changing to uppercase, lowercase with a plugin all this time. Yeah, we introduced uppercase and lowercase quite a while back, probably about 1.5 years ago, maybe. So I'm going to actually change this to center so that this border, right, also kind of spills outside of it. Had some buffer issues. It's okay now. Okay, so there might have been a little bit of a hiccup, but it looks like it might be okay now. Right, so you can play around with some of these blend modes and play around with the different dodging option or the object blur options until you get a nice look, right? Color dodge is pretty good. in this case. Right, there we go. Perfect. All right, that'll do, right? So now, of course, we want to use these for our component and our hover states, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to convert this entire thing into a component. So right-click, make component, or Command or Control K. But I also want to use the background options as a component as well. There we go. And I'm going to turn this, so this automatically converted it into an instance of this component. So I'm going to edit this component over here, and I'm going to create a new hover state. Now actually this is going to be the initial state, or the hover state. So I'm going to go back to the default state and simply just grab these two and just drop the opacity, right? And in the hover state, we'll want to bump up the opacity just like that. Whoops. There we go. So now I can hover, and we've got our fun little looking hover effect, right? And I can continue tweaking that if I wanted to. So maybe in the hover state, maybe one of these, this one here, maybe it just gets a little bit brighter. Just a little bit, just like that, right? Very subtle. So I can go back here, play it, and then whoop, look at that. Fancy, right? So now what we can do is we can actually duplicate this, right? So I can move this down, I can duplicate this downwards, and I can dive in here and write turn off remote deactivation, or whatever it says, right? And then change this to 2. And then I can do one more just down here. And this says distract enemies. Did I spell that right? I did not. And this looks like it's 2 as well. All right. So now we can play, and we've got our various hover states, right? Just like that. Now, as you're noticing, I talked about this, I think, yesterday during my Daily Creative Challenge stream. As I'm hovering down, there's a little bit of a delay. And that's because auto animate is the default action for these particular hover states. So what I can do is I can go down to my main component for this particular hover state, and I'm going to hop into prototype mode right here at the top and simply change this from auto animate to transition, and I can go either none or dissolve. But let's go ahead and just try out none, see what that looks like. And now I can just very easily go down, and it's going to automatically just trigger that hover state, right? And that's the benefit of using separate hover states, right? Some of you might be thinking, why do you have a separate component inside of this larger component just for hover? And that's because if I built everything so let me actually show you this example because I think it's important, right? Let me duplicate this down here. Actually, you know what? Let me move this over here just so we can see what's going on the background. I'm going to ungroup this. And I'm also going to ungroup the hover state that we created, right? Ungroup. I'm going to pop all of this into one single component. And then I'm going to create a hover state. I'm going to dive in here, change the background, bump that up. There we go. And that looks pretty good, right? So if I go back to my default state and then play this, it looks the same, right? So you're probably wondering, what's the difference, right? Here's the difference. If I were to duplicate this component, which again is one component, no other components inside of it, right? Change this to hello, and then play this. Watch what happens, right? I would have to go into the hover state and change that text again, which I don't want to do. Now, this is a limitation that the team wants to fix at some point in the future, but until that's done, if you just use a separate component inside as your hover state, you kind of work around that, right? So a little bit of a pro tip, and it'll save you a ton of time. And you have complete control over that hover state. So if you want to change it completely, all you have to do is just edit the main component of that particular hover state, right? So right click, edit main component, there's just my hover state. So if I wanted to change, maybe when it's hovered, maybe this color or this background color changes to a bit of a red, right? Well, that's not the one. I want to make sure to go to the hover state. That would help, right? So I want to change this to red, right? Change to red. There we go. Oh, I changed the wrong one. That's better, right? I don't like it, but just to show you what would happen. And now I can just hover and all of them will be red, right? So there's a lot of benefits to having separate hover states as components. All right, so let me actually go ahead and delete this background. Delete these because we don't need those anymore. And we've got our elements looking pretty good. I'm gonna group these, call these options. Ooh, caps lock is on. I'm screaming at Adobe XD. Options, just like that. And we've got our tabs over here to the right. And now what we want to do is we want to allow users to either tap or press some sort of button on their gamepad to bring these in, right? Do I have my oh, I do have it. So maybe this will work. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to duplicate this artboard. Command Control D. So we can start working on our additional or our final state when it all comes into play. And we want to start utilizing 3D transforms. So over within the Properties Inspector, I'm going to turn on 3D transforms right there. And I'm going to just start kind of giving this a little bit of perspective. I can pull it up into space as well. Turn this, bring this forward. And now it's kind of like in our face, right? Now on this first artboard, what we want to do is first reduce the opacity of this background layer so that the blur isn't too apparent. And then we want to move these off the artboard. Now, what you're going to notice is that when I move this off the artboard, it's going to pop onto the pasteboard, right? So to avoid that, what you want to do is group these elements with something that's going to remain on this artboard. So I'm going to select the options, the tabs, and also this background layer. Group these and just call this UI, for example. And I want to make sure to do that on this artboard as well. Otherwise, XD really won't know what's going on. So I'm going to group those, call that UI. And now if I go over here, I can move this off the artboard, no problem, right? There we go. So let me go ahead and turn my Xbox controller on, and it's time to wire this up. So I'm going to go into prototype mode, and because we're going to be using a gamepad trigger, what we can do is use any object. So we can use any of these objects, or we can use the background layer to trigger it. So I'm going to select this background layer. I'm going to drag this blue handle over to this second artboard. And then over to the right, we're going to choose keys and gamepad. And in this case, let's go ahead and press the menu button on my Xbox One controller, this one right over here. And as I press these various buttons, it's going to automatically update in Adobe XD. And we want to make sure to use an auto animate for the type, right? So again, XD can recognize the changes and animate those. And that's why it's so important to make sure things are grouped properly. Otherwise, XD can't recognize what those changes were. And we'll go for, let's say, ease in and out and duration of, we'll do something pretty quick, 0.6 seconds. So let's go ahead and press play. I am going to reduce the size of this window only because I'm on like a 5K monitor, and sometimes when it's full screen, it gets a little bit laggy. And I'm gonna go ahead and press the menu button. Whoop. There we go. And of course we can hover, and then we need something to go back. So I'm gonna select the background layer on this artboard, drag a handle over. Let's go ahead and press the B button to go back, right? And we'll do this one more time before we wrap things up. So there we go. Press the menu button, whoop, and press the B button to go back. Pretty fancy. And again, whoop, whoop, whoop. And I can dive in to this first artboard and maybe stagger these a little bit so that when they do come into play, as you're about to see, now again, this window is way too large. Right? Has a little bit of a stagger effect going on. And then press B to close. So that will just about do it for Masterclass number 35. Big thank you to everyone who has joined me today. Cornell, Umacorn, and Salah, and Andres, and Munir, and Kareem, and Laura, Cody, everyone else, great to see all of you. I'm going to be back in about an hour, I don't know, an hour and a half, an hour, something like that, I don't know. But Kyle T. Webster is coming up in just a few minutes with an illustration masterclass. Definitely stick around for that. And I will see you all soon, I suppose. All right, see you later, everyone.